Jedni zakłamują rzeczywistość, my ją odkłamujemy. Takie są media narodowe. Państwo są naszą największą chlubą. Dziękujemy za to, że Państwo nam ufacie, że jest Państwa coraz więcej. 1% podatku to będzie solidne wsparcie dla mediów narodowych, o które prosimy i obiecujemy, że znowu nie zawiedziemy.
So, we are privileged today to welcome on our program the esteemed Professor Paul Gottfried from the United States. Professor Gottfried, how do we hear each other?
We hear each other fine.
Perfectly.
No problem.
I want to start off our discussion today by asking you if you watched President Biden's press conference from a few days back.
I did not watch the press conference itself, although I did hear the things that he said because they were played back, and I reacted with predictable horror to everything that I heard. It confirmed how senile he's become, how often he lies, and the craziness of what he's proposing for this country.
So did anything in particular stand out? Any particular moment that you were more attentive to during that long press conference?
Yeah, I mean, what bothered me was his attempt to racialize anything he disagrees with, even if these were positions that he took himself up until a few months ago. For example, anyone who believes in the value of the filibuster in the Senate, as he did and Barack Obama did until recently, is a racist. Anyone who is against vote harvesting, which is, of course, open to fraud, is a racist. I mean, it's anyone who opposes his attempt to remove voter identification is a racist. And anyone who disagrees with anything the Democrats want to do is a racist. And my question is, how long can his party succeed by using these vicious, divisive tactics?
Well, Professor, you've been around the block for some time now. You've seen very significant aspects of your country's history. And I've noticed that a lot of people are making the analogy that what basically Biden presented at that press conference sort of reminded them of the Soviet Union in the years between 1980 and 1984. How would you comment on that analogy?
Yeah, I hope it's true. I mean, obviously, this man is an even more decrepit version of Brezhnev. What I'm concerned is that we might be living through the Soviet experience in the 1930s or 1940s, when Stalin was seizing power, consolidating power, engaging in terror. I'd be very happy if I could believe that we're at the end of this process of creating a one-party dictatorship, using the Secret Service and the military against anyone who voted for the other side. The comparison to Brezhnev, of course, is flattering, since Brezhnev, even in his worst days, was probably more alert than Joe Biden has been for some time.
Right, and at least Brezhnev did not mistaken his own deputies for being in charge of the Soviet Union, as Biden recently said of President Harris, apparently.
Right.
So that's an important point also. Professor, I want to sort of head into the waters of ideas and ideology at this point, because one of the concepts that a person whom you knew personally, a very important member and inspiring figure for the American right, the late Samuel T. Francis, coined the term anarcho-tyranny at some point during his time. And I've noticed, looking over the American conservative press in the last few months, that a lot of people have picked up on this concept. What did Sam Francis mean when he coined the term anarcho-tyranny, and why is it relevant today?
Yeah, I think Sam, who was actually a close friend of mine, was referring to a political situation in which the state uses power very arbitrarily against its enemies, as Biden's administration is doing right now, but at the same time cannot clean up the mess that it creates, whether it's at the border. They have no control. And I don't think they even want control because they want more people to come in who vote for the Democratic Party, or even with this the attempt to enforce gun laws. There are people running all over the place who own guns illegally. They're stopped. They still own guns illegally. Nothing is done. There are laws in the United States which require, for instance, background check of anyone buying a gun. These laws exist. The Democratic Party, which runs our cities, simply does not enforce these laws. If somebody breaks into the Capitol, this becomes like, Hitler taking over Germany in 1933. But if our cities are burnt down by black radicals and by white radicals who are assisting them, and the forces of George Soros, this is fine. If they shoot people, white or black people, that's fine too. This does not require an investigation. So I think what you see is the juxtaposition of absolute lawlessness on the one side, which is given a pass. I mean, the leftist administration, the kind of bizarre leftist administration that is taking over in these so-called Western liberal democracies, and is epitomized by the American government. These governments do not try to control. In fact, they encourage lawlessness, but then they beat up on people whom they think are opposing it from the right. So this is the way anarcho-tyranny plays out.
So it would sort of be analogous to what Eisenhower said at one point in terms of American allies, that we know he's an SOB, but at least he's our SOB. Would that be a good analogy in a way of what we're seeing right now?
Yeah, it would be. Although I'm not even sure they see them as, these people as SOBs. They ascribe great virtue to the people who are burning down our cities.
Right.
In fact, the military under the new defense minister, Lloyd Austin, who was a radical leftist racialist, black racialist, he, has given instruction to soldiers and officers that they should look upon BLM and Antifa as their allies. The ones that we have to go after are the Trump voters, these are right-wing extremists.
Right.
What you have is the glorification of the lawless and the violent. It's not just a matter of tolerating them; they're being glorified.
Right. Well, that brings me to my next question, because in terms of this rising tide of anarcho-tyranny, we're definitely seeing a breakdown or a realignment of the American political topography, I would like to call it, because for our viewers, I think it's important to know that, the traditional divide between what used to be the moderate left Democrats and the free market, moderate conservative Republican Party has definitely broken down. I think we're seeing many factions coming into play at this point from both the left and the right. And I was wondering if you could describe what the American landscape encompasses at this point in time. What is the right and what is the left in the United States, and what possibly is in between?
Yeah, I think the landscape is much more varied than one might guess from watching CNN and Fox News. Um, I think what we have, are three or four different groups that are aligned across the political spectrum. The people who are now taking power are cultural Marxist leftists. They're not Marxist. They do not have a socioeconomic view of society. They look nothing like the people who ran Poland under Jaruzelski or before that. They're not Marxist or Marxist. They occasionally use that rhetoric and they try to identify with communists, but they're essentially cultural radicals. They hate white people. They hate Christianity. They hate gender roles. They hate the traditional family. And above all, they hate people who cling to their guns and Bibles, the deplorables, the people who
Right.
voted for Trump. And I think what drives the leaders, these woke capitalists and the deep state and so forth, is a desire to marginalize or destroy uh, the the working class, the populist right. They hate these people. There is a sort of a regular Republican center, and these are people who are socially they go along with anything the left does. They just look out for business interests. And these people would include maybe the Wall Street Journal on the right, somebody like Mike Bloomberg on the left. But they're essentially sort of corporate capitalist types who can accommodate themselves with the social conditions as long as they don't become too extreme.
Right.
Then you have the conservative movement sort of moving farther to the right. And the conservative movement, as I've indicated in a number of my pieces in Chronicles magazine and elsewhere, is essentially where the left was a few years ago. What the conservative movement has done, I think, very, very skillfully, is sort of cut off everything that doesn't move with the flow. Everything which would have been the right, let's say around 1980 or certainly 1970s, and they've tried to align themselves with moderate lesbians, moderate feminists, blacks who aren't too radical, and blacks who might be induced to vote Republican. And these are the people you see on Fox News. These are the people who write for the Wall Street Journal, National Review. They're sort of the conservative establishment, which is in no way conservative. What they represent is what the left was before the left reached its latest stage of radicalness, right? The penultimate stage in the development of the left, or something like that. But at the same time, there seems to be a right that is there are a number of rights taking form or taking shape to the right of this, National Review, Fox News, conservatism. And these are all the people who are excluded.
Mm-hmm.
And there are lots and lots of them. As I've argued again and again, most of the people on the right are totally excluded by the conservative movement, which is always trying to be moderate, adopt a conciliatory policy toward those on its left, who is sort of hoping to make more moderate or pull into their movement. But there's a vast assembly of nonconformist, independent right, whatever you might want to call them, and they're not all united. On the extreme right, you have sort of white nationalist, alt-right types, but then you also have another independent right, which seems to be growing. And these are made up largely of, the working class white Trump supporters, and the magazines and websites which support them. And Chronicles is only one of them. I mean, if you look at American Greatness website, for which I write, these people, really, some of them kind of the neoconservatives, they just continue to move to the right. And, I might disagree with them on some philosophical issues. On political issues, we're on the same side. I've noticed that, our magazine Chronicles, we have new subscribers, we're exploding with subscribers. Newsmax, which is to the right of Fox News, is picking up, subscribers and viewers all over the place. Although it's a very boring channel, it doesn't have any of the theatrical or aesthetic features of Fox.
Right.
Fox, meanwhile, is losing. They've now fallen behind CNN and MSNBC. National Review is being, is sort of on life support. And they were never Trump, and they were sort of centrist Republican, always trying to build alliances with the left center, as I indicate in my work on the vanishing tradition, my essays there. They're always trying to make friends on the left. They're not doing well. They're doing very badly. So I think there is an upsurge of support on the independent right. And I'm not indicating here white nationalists or people like that, because, there are some blacks and others Hispanics who they're small minorities, but, they're certainly not being kept out. And there is this independent right. And whether we like Trump or not, the people in this right are fanatical Trump supporters. This is he is the figure around which this movement is coalescing.
Yeah, sort of like a pope figure in a way, almost a cult, for better or for
Yes,
worse.
absolutely. Mhm.
So we're talking about Trump. It's good because a lot of people are asking, especially after that CPAC speech that he gave a few weeks ago, will Trump run again in 2024? He sort of hinted at that during his speech. He was saying, "Who do you think will run in 24? I wonder who it'll be." Wink, wink. And my question to you is, what do you think Trump will do in 24? And if he doesn't run, or if he chooses to run, do you see any potential people coming from any other segments of the Republican Party that might challenge him?
Yeah, personally, I hope he does not run. Uh, I think he was useful in creating a right-wing populist movement. Um, he may be his own worst enemy. He keeps putting his foot in his mouth. He says silly things all the time, even though many of his policies were quite sound. There are other people coming along whom I wouldn't mind seeing run for the presidency. His son is highly articulate. I don't know how deeply he thinks, but he sounds
Which son, Professor? Which son?
actually both of them.
Okay.
But Donald Trump Jr. and was it Eric Trump, the other
Hmm.
one? They both sound extremely intelligent. I don't know how they would conduct themselves as president, but they sound a good deal more coherent and articulate than the dad.
Hmm.
Um, Josh Hawley seems quite good. The young man from Missouri. He's only 38. He's very stiff, but he has sound views about most things. The person I've always liked, but there's no way he's going to win anything beyond the position he now holds, is Rand Paul, the senator from Kentucky.
Right.
I don't trust Ted Cruz at all. I think he
Hmm.
is, particularly on foreign policy, he sounds like a neoconservative.
Right.
And I don't like people who quote Martin Luther King all the time. Uh, I think it's virtue. It's an unseemly virtue signaling toward the left.
So we've mentioned some positive names. Would you attempt to assess anybody who would be, well, maybe not overly never Trump, but spiritually never Trump coming out in 2024 to challenge Trump, like Pompeo or Nikki Haley?
Yeah, I don't like either. I actually dislike Pompeo more than I dislike Nikki Haley. I mean, Haley, I think, is just an opportunist. Pompeo, I think, has really been injected with the neocon poison. He's always talking about we have to stand up for human rights and we have to do this and that. And America's the greatest. I'm wondering if he's looking at the same America that I'm seeing, which is profound, deeply divided, morally adrift, and being taken over by totalitarian maniacs. He obviously is viewing a very different society, maybe, the America of Dwight Eisenhower or something. I do not know or Reagan. I don't know what he's looking at.
Right.
We have to have somebody who has a much more serious sense of the internal crisis in our country, not just the Chinese threat. I think Pompeo carries with him the Russophobic virus of the neoconservatives. He's too anti-Putin for my taste.
Right. Yeah, I think at one point, I think it was 2 years ago, the American Conservative, there was an article which labeled Pompeo as an American Jacobin in a sense. So this virulent
Yes,
ideology of
yes.
believing against all reality that we are still that shining city on the hill, no matter what happens, no matter how many cities burn down, we'll always be that shining city on a hill. Professor, should Antifa be labeled a terrorist organization?
Of course they should. They're a very dangerous terrorist organization. And I think Black Lives Matter is an even more appalling terrorist organization, which all the Democrats, of course, support, and they even incited them to their violent action. But I certainly think Antifa should be labeled a terrorist, and so, as I said, so should Black Lives Matter, which may be even more dangerous.
Because the reason why I'm asking this is because Antifa seems to be, and we talked about the topography in the United States currently, a sort of, you know, a sidekick to what's known right now as the intersectional left in the United States. And this concept is being talked about by both sides. So I want to ask you, as a historian of ideas, what differs the intersectional left from the traditional Marxist left? Because I noticed that, you know, there are some overlaps, but I think too many people are going into generalizations that you mentioned at the beginning, that what we have right now is basically a straight up continuation of, you know, Engels, Marx, and the Soviet Union. What's your take?
Yeah, well, I think the conservative establishment has two reasons for taking this preposterous position, and I think it's preposterous. Number one, you already have people hooked on the Cold War, right, and the Soviet enemy, and you know, fighting world communism and Reagan's anti-communism and so forth. So then, what you can do is simply try to identify the current left with the communists. And you know, it's sort of it's a sort of a rhetorical trick that you're playing, because obviously they're very different. Um, the other reason I think some people are taking this position on the conservative movement is it's much easier to fight a socioeconomic enemy,
Right.
so, you know, which is socialist. We're going to fight the socialists, and the socialists are going to destroy your income, and they're going to take away your money. This is an easier fight than saying these people want to destroy your family. They're destroying gender roles. They're destroying, you know, the foundations of any normal society, and you have to fight them for that. This is what makes them primarily dangerous. They also hate the white race, even if they're crazy white people who are behind this. um, so, I mean, this is a much more difficult battle to fight. And you may lose most of the people, and you know, who are giving money to the conservative establishment if you frame the argument in that way. Um, the other point that I would raise is that Marxists tend to be socially very conservative, much more so than the present American society. You know, they threw homosexuals in concentration camps. The intersectional left glorifies homosexuality. You know, I mean, you could just imagine what their view of transgender would have been in the Marxist Leninists. Um, yeah, I mean, they were interested in socioeconomic transformation, and they were willing to tolerate, you know, social conservatism to whatever extent it was necessary to maintain their control. The cultural Marxists are exactly the opposite. They're not really, I think the word Marxist is misleading. I just can't find, maybe intersectional works better, because they're not really Marxist. They're cultural social radicals who are only secondarily interested in economic change.
And, you know, this is coming straight from the sources, because I always wonder why we choose to sometimes label our enemies by labels that they don't use themselves. It's like, you know, they're telling us what they are. It's like Osama bin Laden. He told, you know, the United States why 9/11 happened, because of your foreign policy, because of what you did in the Middle East. And all of a sudden, George W. Bush comes out. No, it's because we have women in the workplace, because we drink beer after work, and so on and so on. And I'm getting the idea sometimes that, you know, a lot of these honest intersectional lefties are telling us, no, we're interested in a revolution of a totally different kind, a cultural revolution, but they're still being labeled as, you know, the heirs and disciples of Brezhnev, of Marx, as some secret continuation of the KGB. And, you know, it does bring a lot of confusion into the realm of political reflection.
Yeah, one of the interesting questions that these people are never addressing is, why are all these corporate capitalists intersectional leftists?
Right.
You know, they weren't running to join the Communist Party, but they do not feel endangered by any of this stuff, and they know that, you know, if they're going to start to tax somebody, they're not going to be taxed anyhow, because they're part of the leftist establishment, the intersectional leftist establishment. They run the intellect. I mean, they're the ones who pay for they look at the electronic media giants in the United States. You know, look how much they did to bring the left to power, and to punish people who, you know, insist on gender differences, who don't accept gay marriage. they're in the forefront of the intersectionality. So I mean, to see these people as somehow the intended victims of a Marxist revolution is utter nonsense.
One can argue Stalin would probably have them all shot. Uh,
Yes,
at some point,
to
at
his
least.
credit.
Amen. A lot of people are asking, Professor, in Poland, I've been hearing this question a lot because, you know, we're seeing the balkanization of the United States in basically every realm. And the question keeps on repeating itself. Will the United States come apart? Will we see secessions of states in the near future? For example, I know there was talk about this in Texas recently, although that was probably for political propaganda purposes. But we want to hear it straight from Professor Paul Gottfried. Do we see any chances of secession in the United States in the near future?
Well, you're not going to see secession. I mean, it was tried once before in 1861. And it cost 710,000 lives, you know, to force the South back into the Union. And I think any attempt by the right to secede, or by people who are fighting the intersectional left, will be met by force. And the military right now is in the hands of the crazy left, right? And so the Secret Service. So they're not going to let anybody go. There's not going to be secession. What is possible, however, is that since half the country, probably more than that by now, dislikes this leftist, potentially totalitarian regime under which we are living, what does seem likely is that most of these people who are concentrated in red states or in areas like mine, which are made up almost entirely of deplorables, they're probably going to work toward decentralization. They're going to ignore federal guidelines. They'll ignore federal directives. They'll hold on to they're not going to take their guns away because that could create tremendous problems. And of course, the only one whose guns will be taken away are the law-abiding citizens, right? Because the criminal elements are actually aligned with this government. You know, they start rioting, shooting people. They say they're victims of racism or something like that. So the criminal elements are just part of the regime now. In fact, it follows very closely the theory of totalitarianism that you find in Hannah Arendt, who points out totalitarian regimes absorb the thugs and the criminal elements. They become part of a terrorist regime.
Right.
And I think the United States is definitely moving in that direction. But you're going to get areas that try to detach themselves, not by explicitly seceding, but by simply not following federal, ignoring them, and also people stacking up weapons and guns. This is happening right now, and you're really not going to send in the military, you know, and have a shootout in every one of these red areas. But this is happening. I mean, there's people are making runs on gun shops and so forth. And I think the long range possibility here is they will secede. One of the things I'm not going to count on is that in a year and a half, Mitch McConnell and the Senate will have a majority of Republicans and will all be over. That's nonsense.
Right.
Within the next year, the totalitarian regime that is now taking power in this country will seize everything. We'll have a one-party dictatorship. I think they may well succeed in doing that. They'll get rid of the filibuster. They'll put through this fraudulent voting scheme. One party with the NR1, whatever they're calling it, voting proposal. They'll make Washington, the city of Washington, which is 99.9% left-wing Democrat, they'll make them a state. They will pack the courts. They'll do everything. They'll just take over. And there will be no 2 years even to worry about. They'll try to establish a one-party dictatorship. But I think what is going to happen is more and more of these regions are going to try to detach themselves. I think Mike Pompeo is like living in a dream world. You know, it's sort of like America at the end of the Second World War or some at the beginning of the Cold War. He obviously is not seeing the America that people on the traditional right are are observing right now. So I think this is the way detachment or decentralization will take place.
So when one considers all that, I mean, and you take into consideration all the talk right now, especially after the meeting in Anchorage between the American delegation and the Chinese delegation, where from what I saw, at least, the Americans basically took a beating from the Chinese representatives. They really had no idea how to answer what was said to them. Or basically the Chinese said, you're in no position to lecture us about anything, basically. You know, you have to ask yourself the question. I think Darren J. Beatty over at Revolver News made this point that whereas the United States, you have federal institutions, state-run institutions, teaching people to hate their own country, and China, it's totally the opposite. You're being, you know, you're becoming more of a manly state. You're becoming an empire in essence. You're being taught to love your country, to invest in its resources and its people, and so on and so on. So do you think that a lot of this China talk, which we're witnessing right now, is basically a sort of redoing of Cold War rhetoric that does not necessarily apply, especially taking into consideration the cultural position of the United States today?
Yeah, I think the attacks on China serve a number of purposes. One of them, a strictly partisan purpose, since the Democratic Party is awash in Chinese money, starting with the titular head of the government, Joe Biden, that by attacking the Chinese, you at least by implication attacking the Democratic Party.
Right.
And you're also forcing them to be more confrontational. And I'm not even sure they know how to do that at this point, because you know they're basically the poodles of the Chinese government. But they might do something really stupid, you know, in order to show that they're how anti-Chinese they are. Um, the thing that I find most disturbing about this is that you turn on Fox News and you get Gordon Chang, and then you get a whole bunch of others, Steve Mosher, all these people. China is a great danger, and we have to
Right.
stand up for democracy and human rights and this and that. Our country is falling apart. you know, do they really think we're going to unite our the military is being taught to hate the United States as a white, racist, sexist country. This is what the military is, and the Secret Service. Um, do you really think we're in any kind of condition to take on the Chinese? I think we first have to clean up things at home, if it's still possible. I don't even know if it's possible anymore. Um, but pulling out this Cold War, America stands for democracy kind of rhetoric is utter nonsense. And this is what you get from Fox News. This is what you get from the neocons and so forth. And but on Fox News, this alternates with scenes of how terrible things are under Biden. Everything is fall. Well, if
Right.
everything is falling apart, I would think that dealing with internal problems, should be the first issue that we have to address. It's not, standing up for Hong Kong or what are these Muslims here, the Uyghurs or something.
Yeah, the Uyghurs.
you know, I, we have to help Muslims. The thing I find this remarkable is they're killing Christians. Muslims are killing Christians all over the world,
Right.
but we have to stand up for Muslims somewhere. I mean, this is remarkable.
Well, I always like to make this provocative analogy, and I know it ticks a lot of people off, but from what I remember, the last time the United States helped Muslims in any organized fashion, a few years later, you had planes flying into the World Trade Center by guys who are trained in that same country. So, yeah, I think we definitely have to take it easy on this international aid to Muslims anywhere. I think they can take care of themselves in that or in a different regime or anywhere. Professor, I know you are currently writing a new book on anti-fascism. You've already written a great book on fascism, which I recommend to everybody, and maybe we might have a Polish translation soon. I'm hoping for that. But your new book is about anti-fascism, and I would like you to elaborate. What can we expect from reading this upcoming literature of yours?
Yeah, I have to say it was a book that my editor, the acquisition editor at Cornell, sort of pushed me into writing because the one on fascism did so well. And the other one who pushed me into writing was Stanley Payne, who's like the world's expert on fascism. And what he liked about my book on fascism was particularly my discussion of anti-fascism. In this book, I begin by looking at contemporary anti-fascist groups in America, actually in the Anglophile, or rather the Anglophone world, Anglophone world. And these groups are generally, part of the intersectional left. And everyone the intersectional left doesn't like is not just a racist, a homophobe, an enemy of transgendering and so forth. The person is a fascist. And the word fascist means, not somebody who supports Mussolini's corporate state, but rather somebody who's a guard at Auschwitz concentration camp or something like that. So as soon as you oppose them, I mean, they not only racialize the opposition, but they fascize the opposition. And fascist means being supportive of Hitler and the Third Reich and Hitler's final solution.
Right.
And I sort of try to look at how things how anti-fascism became what it is right now. And what I argue is that anti-fascism really the ultimate enemy. It's like, as you know, Schmidt fan and scholar, and Schmidt speaks about, the friend-enemy distinction. Well, the ultimate enemy, the ultimate foe is fascism, right? Is, a subcategory of fascism. If you're a racist or if you're a homophobe or a sexist, and people tell you this, people like Jason Stanley, Tim Snyder, Bray, other people who are, declared or self-described anti-fascist, tell you if you voted for Donald Trump, it means you would have welcomed Hitler with open arms.
Right.
So the ultimate enemy is fascism, and fascism means Hitler and Hitler's final solution. And what I do is in the work is sort of go back and look at anti-fascism from the 1920s on. And anti-fascism is pretty weak in the 1920s because most people don't care much about Mussolini's Italy. You have a few Marxists writing about it. Gramsci writes, but generally people are not interested. It's only when Hitler takes power in Germany that fascism as Nazism becomes a problem. And then you got some very interesting theorists, some of the Marxists writing works trying to explain Nazism. Most of these works take a structural approach, that there's a crisis of capitalism, and the Nazis take power in order to prevent a workers' revolution or socialist revolution, something like this. But then by the end of the Second World War, you're getting a very different understanding of fascism. It's no longer structural. It is psychological, right? The new theory that becomes identified with the Frankfurt School, which finds a second life after the Second World War, in the United States, as well as, in Frankfurt, it sort of goes back and becomes the Institut für Sozialforschung, becomes associated with the University of Frankfurt, but it's all over the place. I mean, the influence of the Frankfurt School, and the great enemy for them is fascism, and fascism is based on sexual fantasies, sexual frustration, living in an authoritarian home with an authoritarian father, and so forth. So we sort of move from a structural understanding of fascism to a psychological understanding of fascism, that people become fascists because they're mentally ill, right? Essentially. And from there, we move on to what you have now, is that people become fascist. That is, they do not support the left's agenda because they're vicious, hateful people. And something has to be done to eliminate them. To remove them from society. It's no longer just that they're psychologically twisted, or they're emotionally twisted, or have sexual frustrations. It's that they're evil people. And they're evil because they read the Bible, because they believe in traditional bourgeois Christian values or Judeo-Christian values or something like this. So it is very important to re-educate them and to eliminate those, whom you can't re-educate. So it was sort of moved beyond the Frankfurt School, anti-fascism. One of the things I point out is the Frankfurt School was relatively conservative on some issues. For instance, they were very critical of homosexuality. They viewed it as sexual deviance. Unlike Fox News and National Review, they would not have been in favor of gay marriage. I mean, they considered gayness to be a psychological problem. So they were not as they were more traditional Freudians in that sense. They were not as radical on these cultural social issues as the left has become, and even the conservative movement has become, in an effort to accommodate the left.
Right. One can argue that it's moved from structural criticism, then as it became, as you said, a psychological phenomenon. I would say that today we've moved even further, because I think we're now labeling fascism as a genetic phenomenon, because the fact that you're born into a Christian home and you're white, and that you haven't been aborted, that makes you a fascist, It could be argued that way, and I'm seeing that's the way that the discussion is going in a very rapid pace, even in Poland.
Yeah, there's also something else connected to this, which is the Holocaust. Blame for the Holocaust is always sort of spread. I mean, we had this discussion about supposedly how the Poles were committed the Holocaust, even though they were being killed and put in concentration camps by the Nazis, they really committed the Holocaust. But it's not just the Poles. By now, you have Norwegians, French, everybody. Everybody did. I mean, the blame is just the Americans. It's just spread out. The view of Nazis that I was raised with, back in the 1950s, is they weren't Christians. They were just sort of crazed neo-pagans or something like that. Now they're Christians. They're white Christians, and this is what caused them to murder all these people. That from the late 1960s on, that becomes integral to the Holocaust narrative. As Peter Novick shows in his book on the Holocaust in American culture, or American life. I think the way the Holocaust is sort of reconfigured or retold in such a way as to blame all white Christians. This feeds into this anti-fascist hysteria.
Right. Professor, you are a fan of Central Europe. You have a Hungarian heritage in your blood. You're very fond of Poland and other Central European countries. So my final question is, as a warning shot, I guess, across the bow, what can Central Europe, what can Poland expect in the next few years from the Biden or the Harris administration? What should we be prepared for, and what countermeasures politically and on the international stage and as a series of countries can we take?
Well, one of the things, I think we've had this discussion before, one of the things that I think is necessary is not to bend to blackmail or pressure. We want you to pay off this group or accept blame for something else. Just ignore this, because once you give it to this sort of moral blackmail, it just goes on and on. There's no ending it. You're not going to buy off your enemies by doing that. I think one of the things that the Poles might try to do is to gain leverage between Putin's Russia and Biden's America, not show the kind of craven dependence upon the United States which one would expect from Merkel in Germany or the German government, which I think is despicable in how obsequious it has become. I would expect the Poles to show more of a spirit of national independence.
Right. Okay. Well, I certainly hope our own neoconservative government takes that advice to heart. Hope is a virtue after all. Professor, thank you very much for that exchange. We hope to have you on the program sometime in the future as things develop in the United States. and ideologically worldwide. And keep on doing the Lord's work, and hope to hear from you soon. Thank you once again.
Thank you. Okay.